Thank you for coming. It was one of those really funny days, too sunny, too certainly stormy. At 5 o'clock, I thought, well, we're going to have a power outage and we'll cancel the program. Now it's beautiful, so this is great. I'm Bob Jolly, Athenaeum Director. Thank you all for coming. We are in for an interesting evening with Susan Clark, and here is Karen Bufka to introduce her and our program. Thank you.
Hey, guys. I'm glad you came. Oh, hello, more faces that I'm happy to see. So first, we're in for a treat. But before Susan starts, I'd like to just say a couple of things. First, of course, thank you to Bob and the staff of the Athenaeum for both co-presenting and hosting our program tonight. And second, this program is co-presented by the League of Women Voters here in the Northeast Kingdom. So if you're not familiar with the League, it is a nonpartisan national volunteer organization open to both women and men, which was founded in 1920 when it became evident that women would indeed get the vote, but that they would need to learn both how to engage in the process of voting as well as learn how to make an informed choice at the polls. The League's mission, therefore, is to encourage informed and active participation in government, work to increase understanding of major public policy issues, and influence public policy through education and advocacy. Now, the way that we're doing that here in the Northeast Kingdom is by working to improve civics education in our schools and to encourage young voters to actually get out and vote. Last year, we offered 2 candidate forums to help citizens get to know some of their candidates better. Tonight is the second event in our Engaged Citizenship series here at the Athenaeum. Other topics in this series will include critical thinking, citizen leadership, and the importance of everyone's participation in our democracy. Next month, on the 29th, we will host Miriam Vincent, staff attorney at the Federal Register, to help us better understand the Electoral College. Next year, we intend to offer more candidate forums, present a voter's guide, and of course, get out the vote. If you would like to learn more about the League, please stop by our table after the program. Now, we are so lucky that Susan Clark is going to share her research and stories about civic dialogue with us tonight. Susan is a facilitator, is co-author of the book Slow Democracy, Rediscovering Community, Bringing Decision-Making Back Home, and All Those in Favor with Frank Bryan about town meeting. She is the town moderator of Middlesex, Vermont, and last but not least, she's a member of the League of Women Voters. So we're so lucky to have her, and I hope you enjoy. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you so much. I am so excited to be here. And actually, I did have a power outage while I was printing my little speech, actually. And luckily, it came back on before I left the house, or you'd be hearing half a speech. But I'm really happy to be in St. Johnsbury. I'm happy to be at the Athenaeum. I used to come here as a little girl. My grandparents were from St. Johnsbury, so special place. And I am a proud League of Women Voters member. Very happy to be supporting the League in any way that I can. And if you get a chance to look into some of the work that the League does, all of the things that Karen named, but in addition, for decades they've been working on civic dialogue, how to bring people together around difficult issues, work through them, find consensus, and move forward with their positions. Their position statements, when the League takes a position on something nationally, it's because it has gone through meticulous grassroots work to find their position. So really worth looking into their model. It's pretty cool. I would just like to know a little bit about you guys. I'd love to know where we're all from. How many from St. Johnsbury? How many live in town? A lot. All right, great. What other towns are we from? I see some non-hands. So, Danville, Barnet, great, excellent. Walden, Lyndonville, Waterford. Wow, all over the place. Wonderful. All right, great. And I'm always interested in local democracy. Do we have any elected officials here? No, they're not. Yes?
I am St. Johnsbury's sole
Cemetery Commissioner, yes. All right. Thank you for doing that. You're probably taking care of my grandparents' grave, actually. So thank you for that. Any people volunteering on boards? What different, yeah, a couple volunteers, yeah. What kinds of positions?
Arts.
All right, arts. Wow, and then you came to visit. Bless you. That's great. You double karma today. Yeah.
Rural
All right, great. Others, yeah?
I'm a representative for Solid Waste District.
Solid Waste District. These are the people who are doing this. This is the work of community. Yeah.
And the St. Johnsbury Community Justice Center.
Excellent. Community Justice Center. Great. Others? Thought I saw a hand. Yeah.
Umbrella, it's an organization to support victims of domestic
Yes.
violence, support families, children.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you very much for all the work that you're doing. Really, really appreciate hearing about that. How many people have gotten more involved since the November election? In anything? Yeah, lots. Okay. How many people have gotten less involved since the November election? Any? No? Good. Glad to hear it. I've heard some people say, they're a little frustrated. But with how they can make their voice heard, regardless of how they felt about, the outcomes. But we're living in interesting times. And I have one last question for you, which is, what would you like to know? When you came tonight, you had something in mind. There was a reason that you came. So I'm curious if there's one question that you could leave tonight knowing a little bit more about, what might that be? Yes.
I think it was interesting the way you just framed things about people being, you were making an assumption about the election and people's response to it. And I came because I'm curious how to create dialogue so that we're not making those assumptions and we're opening up that conversation.
Excellent. I appreciate that. And you're right. The way that I framed that was, could have been perceived as being, geez, everybody's unhappy with the results. In fact, as we will get to, I think everybody's unhappy with the polarization. That's what I meant to say, but you're right. I didn't say it right. So. Thank you for that. And so, how can we get beyond some of that polarization? How can we frame things better? Yeah. Okay. Other questions that people come with? Thoughts? That's the one. Okay. Great. If others come up, let me know. In our time together, here's my plan. We'll talk a little about today's political climate. I'm excited to share some stories about people moving beyond polarity. And many of these are stories that I did collect when writing, co-authoring Slow Democracy, the book with Woden Teach Out. And some of them are brand new. And along the way, what I hope to do is identify some tools that might be useful for you to put to use in your communities. And we will definitely have time for Q&A, but if as I talk, there's something that you want to ask about, please feel free to interrupt. Come on in, make yourself at home. So you've come tonight because you're concerned, presumably, about critical issues. For some people, they're actual topics, things like terrorism, immigration, economic justice, climate change, energy security, and many of us are concerned that we aren't being particularly productive in finding solutions. So tonight we're going to talk about moving beyond polarity and why that is the best way to create lasting change. Otherwise, if we're talking about winning, the winning is only temporary, whereas what becomes permanent is the battle. So if, the fact that you came, the fact that you have these concerns, you're not alone. And despite the fact that we do live in polarized times today, I think that there are a number of things that the vast majority of Americans can agree on. And one of them is that our traditional structures for working together, AKA the government, we the people, aren't being particularly effective right now in finding solutions. Americans' belief in our leaders right now is low enough that it actually could be kind of comical if it weren't so serious. Just before the November elections, when people's energy is traditionally pretty high, enthusiasm is high for candidates, Americans' distaste for both Trump and Clinton was record-breaking. At that point, 538.com reported Clinton and Trump are both more strongly disliked than any nominee at this point in the past 10 presidential cycles. If you fast forward to today, whereas the average approval rating for a president in his first quarter is 63%, the most recent Gallup polls has Trump hovering around a pretty dismal 40% approval rating. Meanwhile, in the legislative branch, Humorist Andy Borowitz tells us that Americans remain deeply divided over what kind of animal they would like to see Congress mauled by. A majority of Americans say they would enjoy seeing Congress torn limb from limb by a ferocious bear, but they disagree on what kind of bear. Most of them went with grizzly, but polar bears came in second. Black bears actually distant third. You can't see the pictures, you're welcome to move forward. Okay, so why? Why are we so unhappy with our government? Of course, not achieving our personal policy goals, whatever they might be, is significant. But there's another key factor, and it's a key factor for all of us, and that is our role as citizens. There was a survey done this fall by the University of Maryland. It showed that there is widespread agreement, and again, across party lines, like agreement across party lines, imagine that voters want to do a lot more than just vote. So I have a couple sample questions from the survey. Here's one of them. When different political parties compete for influence in a democracy, which do you think most often happens? Okay, A or B? A, the competition of ideas creates a vibrant system where many voices are heard, leading to decisions that best reflect the will of the people. That's A. B, the parties fight for their narrow interests, the will of the people is ignored, and the results do not serve the people. Okay, so we can all agree on something. Yay! The percentage of all voters selecting B was 88%. It was slightly higher for Republicans, 90%. 90 or more, slightly lower for Democrats, 85 to 86. Although, watch out for those angry Clinton supporters, 96% voted B. Here's a second question that was on the survey, surprising agreement about what we should do about it. What do we do? Okay, so here was the question. Do you think that in the United States today, A, elections have proven to be an adequate means for the people to express their views on what the government should do? Or B, elections alone are not enough. The government should make an active effort in between elections to find out how people view the issue. Okay, guess what? B, widespread agreement across the parties, between 80 to 89%, depending on how angry you were, chose B. Voting is not enough. We want to be heard. Americans want to be heard. But maybe the most poignant statistic in the last election is the silent alarm bell that was being sounded by the many, many Americans who didn't vote at all. These folks showed the most convincing way that they know of to show that they believe that their voice does not matter at all. So yes, we are united in our unhappiness with the government, and we need another way to do things. And we need it fast, which brings me to slow, and what my co-author and I call slow democracy. So how do we define this term, slow democracy? I'm going to tell you specifically, and this will bring us to this theme of being beyond polarity. I'm going to throw 3 pieces of jargon at you. These will be the main jargon for the night, though, don't worry. Slow democracy is local decision-making, more of it done at the local level, and the processes should have 3 elements. The first one's inclusion. I hope you can read that first one. It's a little blue on blue. When we say inclusion, we don't mean that everybody is represented. We mean everybody gets to participate if they want to. In Vermont's town meetings, we're kind of used to this idea that, you can go if you want to. Not everybody does, but we're all invited. That's the quality of inclusion that we're talking about. Deliberation is a second quality. And deliberation, we define this really rigorously. We don't mean just talking. We're talking about a rigorous process that includes gathering solid, balanced information, weighing your options so that you can actually talk about the trade-offs, and creating solutions together. So in a deliberative process, it's not a debate. It's not A versus B. In a deliberative process, it's let's co-create C. Let's do this together. That's a deliberation. And the third one, power. Not just advisory, but actually when we come together, there's a clear link to real change. The trick with these three is that you don't get to pick and choose. It's important that all three of these elements are in place. There's some magic stardust here. There are some studies that are showing us that when combined, these three things together help us slow down, and that slowness helps us become less polarized and more productive. So why? What is that about? Why could slow possibly help? When I told my husband I wanted to write a book called Slow Democracy, he was like, sounds great. Maybe you can get the domain name, slowdemocracy.org. And it turned out he was joking. He was like, while you're at it, why don't you see if you can get painfuldentistry.org as well? Who wants things to be more slow? And I think you'll see that what we were talking about is really along the lines of the slow food movement. Let's really look at the process from the ground up and get people involved all the way through, and really respect the engagement. So why does slow help in democracy? Here's a little secret that I'll just share with you that probably none of you have ever noticed before, but it's really hard to sit and listen to people that we don't agree with. Does anybody else have that problem? You're thinking, no, I don't have that problem. The problem is not that I have trouble listening. The problem is that my brother-in-law won't shut up, right? Actually, in fact, brain science shows that we all suffer from this problem. And by the way, it is true for both liberals and conservatives. So there was a well-known study that was done in 2006. It's been repeated multiple times since then, and all showing the same data over and over again. Researchers wired up some voters to explain what exactly happens inside our brain when we receive new information, especially when we perceive that new information doesn't fit our worldview. So we had a group of self-described Republicans and Democrats, and each of them were subjected to unflattering information about their own party's candidates. According to their MRIs, when subjects were confronted with information that contradicted their biases, their brains actually underprocessed the information. The prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for conscious reasoning, hardly even fired. So instead, what happened was that the emotional circuits in the brain lit up. So basically, their participants' brains were using emotion to ignore information that they didn't like, but they couldn't discount intellectually. So remember, this is a physiological reaction. It might be thanks to our tribal ancestors. Thank you very much, evolution, right? When we hear things we don't like, it's almost as if we're hardwired to put our fingers in our ears and go, I can't hear you, I can't hear you. This closed-mindedness, which might have been an advantage, right? When we had to band together, as tribes, evil, good, us, them, it was helpful then. It's not very helpful in today's fast-moving world when we need to come up with new solutions. How can we come up with creative new ideas if our brains literally won't take in the new information? The answer is that we can't. Many of today's hot topics, things like climate change, things like race, immigration, they are so complex that they are what analysts call wicked problems. Has anybody heard that term, wicked problem? It's not just a problem from Maine. It's wicked. There's a sort of a continuum of simple problems, complicated, complex, and a subset of complex problems called wicked problems. Wicked problems means there's no one right answer, especially usually because there's competing underlying values. So for instance, citing windmills is a good example in my mind of a wicked problem, because on the one hand, I really want to support alternative energy. And on the other hand, I really want to protect our beautiful ridgelines. So it's the good guys versus the good guys. There's not a simple let's just look to science for an answer. It means we're going to have to talk about it and have trade-offs. Colorado State University Professor Martin Carcassonne explains that the most problem-solving models, most of the time when we have a problem, when we look for models of how to solve it, they rely on one of two things, either expertise, what do the experts say? The more we know, the better answer we'll get. Or on activism. How can I make sure that my solution wins out over your solution? Wicked problems are inherently different. They don't respond to expert technical solutions, and they don't respond to deal making. What do they respond to? They respond to slow, trusting, face-to-face communication. They respond to sitting down and saying, well, here's what I think, well, here's what I think. Well, now that I've taken what you think into consideration, how can I change? How can we come up with a solution? It's iterative, it's back and forth, it's slow, it's actually usually continual, like the way we run school systems. School systems are what would be called a wicked problem. Because every child is different, so it has to have constant communication. We learn, we change, we come back, we revisit, we learn, we change. Solutions begin when we recognize that with wicked problems, it's the problem that's wicked and not the people involved. Because brain science tells us that we can use our full intellectual capacity better when we don't trigger that fight or flight, us-them response. So we need techniques to frame issues and engage people in less polarizing ways so that we can bring people out of their corners and find common ground, and that's slow democracy. So the timing of this really could not be better, because the internet, by the way, has completely changed the way we think. Today's voters are veterans of the open source revolution, whether they're 20-year-old millennials or whether we're 80-year-olds. We know that we can now research and communicate and self-organize at record speed, and we do. So we no longer have that sort of 1950s leave it to the experts, attitude about citizenship. We have completely different expectations for citizenship. We grab our phones and we find the answers ourselves. Governments can benefit if we as the government, because the government is us, if we can treat citizens as collaborative equals and work less like a hierarchy and more like a wiki, then communities can use these kinds of decentralized bottom-up strategies. They can skip the negativity and the pushback and the disgruntled voters and instead really reap the rewards of innovation and of information sharing. So I just want to be clear that polarization is actually really good for certain things. It has its purposes. It's one of the reasons that it exists. It's extremely useful if you're mobilizing your troops. You can offer a polarizing message when you want immediate short-term involvement, when you want commitment to a single answer. It's a critical element of generating outrage. And if that's what you need, go for it. And that's what's happening. But there are also times when polarization is not useful, as we all know, otherwise we wouldn't be here today. It's counterproductive when we're trying to assimilate new information. It's antithetical to long-term diverse collaboration, especially if we're trying to generate new answers together. And ultimately, polarization is not sustainable at the community level, which I think probably most of you who've ever served on a committee knows. So very briefly, what slow democracy is and is not. It's not spin, it's not optics, it's not framing to win, and it's not A versus B. It's honest, it's authentic, it's framing to help new ideas emerge. Let's co-create seed. So what does it look like in practice? Okay, now come the stories, okay? Enough of this theory, let's tell some stories. Here's a wonderful place that I'm sure many of you have been. Anybody recognize Portsmouth, New Hampshire? Beautiful, picturesque city, about 20,000 people, as you know, right on the Maine-New Hampshire border. Political scientists from around the world have descended on Portsmouth. Portsmouth has received multiple awards, international attention, for the changes in their decision-making process. So what is the story with civic dialogue in Portsmouth? Okay, there's a little background here. Portsmouth used to be the home of the Pease Air Force Base. Anybody remember the Pease? Yes, we remember that. I remember it from when I was a kid. When that Air Force Base closed, it dislocated 4,000 military personnel and another 2,400 related jobs. So you can imagine displaced workers, changing economies, and in Portsmouth, just to make matters even worse, the demographics and the shifts that happened meant that the elementary schools got completely out of whack. 2 schools became under-enrolled, and the other one was bursting at the seams. Anybody who's ever been involved in redistricting or school consolidation, Act 46, any of that kind of stuff, knows that changing the way schools work is one of the, especially elementary schools, it's one of the most divisive things that communities can go through. Money, kids, I mean, it's touching all of the electrical third rails. And in Portsmouth, there were some real class issues at work as well. The under-enrolled schools were in the less wealthy parts of town, and parents didn't want to send their kids to the other side of the tracks. So there was this political hot potato, and it got passed on from year to year. Any politician who touched it was committing political suicide. Two schools with empty classrooms, and in another one, they are actually literally teaching kids in the corridors. There were teachers using closets for office space, and it went on for 10 years. So Portsmouth was desperate. The leaders did not know what to do. They didn't know what the answer was. So the superintendent and the school board decided to ask the people. They took a chance on something called study circles, a study circles technique. So study circles, and if anybody's interested, you can Google study circles. Everyday Democracy is the name of the organization. They do them all over the country. Each one's a little bit different. But it has all the elements of slow democracy. It's inclusive, it's deliberative, and power, meaning it truly does not start with the answer. The answer comes out of the process. So your involvement actually matters. So in Portsmouth, inclusion meant using classic community organizing techniques, beating the bushes to get good socioeconomic diversity that really represented the city, age and gender, socioeconomics, old-timers, newcomers, and importantly, parents and taxpayers from all three of the schools. They got 105 people to commit to a series of meetings. I believe it was 5 meetings, and they said, you've got to commit to coming to all of these every week or every other week. So they broke up the 105 people into smaller groups, 8 smaller groups, again being careful that each of the groups had a decent demographic mix. And in the early meetings, the groups rotated among the 3 schools. They got tours from the principals, which is key. I mean, and imagine, a lot of these people probably had only been to their own school. They hadn't necessarily visited all 3 schools. They were getting really good, sound, solid, firsthand information. With hands-on fact-finding. And good information is really key to good deliberation. They also moved into some trust-building dialogue. And this is really, really critical. People often want to dive straight into the fight. A lot of those people came because they knew that they wanted to close that school, or they wanted to move those kids, or they had the answer in their mind, and that's why they wanted to get involved. And that's often the case with public engagement. They wanted to argue pro and con. This is the slow part of slow democracy. They had to spend at least I think it was about 1.5 meetings, listening to each other's experiences in the schools and building trust. So sharing stories as parents, as neighbors, as taxpayers, building understanding. This dialogue is a key element, actually not only of good deliberation, but also of inclusion. Because many of us do not want to get involved in public issues unless the setting is safe and respectful. So a visual like that, where people are sitting in a circle, they know that the conversation is going to be, low-key, probably pretty personal, that feels much more safe than a big public room with, likelihood of having to give a speech. We don't want speechifying, we want civil, meaningful conversation. And study circles guaranteed that. So the small group conversations are a critical preface to the next step, which is the face-to-face deliberation. And in Portsmouth, the way they framed the question was really important. It wasn't like, should we shut down school A? It wasn't a sort of win-lose kind of proposition. In Portsmouth, the way they framed the question was, what issues should the redistricting committee consider in balancing enrollments of the schools? So you can see that it was a very open-ended, there's no wrong answers to that question, but it does invite lots of different perspectives. They didn't ask for the solution, they identified the underlying values. And ultimately, the groups reported back to the school board. And here's the key thing. The school board had been on board from the very beginning, right? So they were dying for this information. This means there was a real link to decision-making power. If I was in one of those small groups, I knew that what I was saying was going to be heard, and people really wanted to hear it. So the findings were, in fact, scooped right up. One of the keys to our ultimate success, I think, was after 10 years of frustration, the school board was able to propose this it was a $2 million at the time, because it was a few years ago, in facility improvements, and it received broad support, and it was approved. Remember, it had 105 ambassadors, right, who understood and supported this answer. And the proposal was well informed by the citizens that it was going to affect, so it made sense on the ground. In the end, only 65 students had to switch schools at the beginning, so it was a very well-timed, gradual answer. So this is the mandatory bridge slide, bridging the divide. This is the bridge that spans the Piscataqua into Maine, but right outside of Portsmouth. This study circles process spanned a gap that had, for a decade, seemed unbridgeable. And so you can see, in a way, why slow is a tongue-in-cheek kind of term. It took months to have those discussions and build that trust and put forward the proposal that everybody understood and supported. But compared to 10 years of gridlock, what is slow about that? It's the kind of thing that it's hard to embrace at the beginning, and then you realize that it actually can move forward more quickly. So in the past decade, actually even longer, Portsmouth has addressed other issues using similar techniques. This is where Portsmouth really took off, and this is where people started paying attention at the international level. They have now used it twice for their master plan, the city master plan, a city of 20,000 people. They've updated it, and involved thousands of people in updating their master plan. They did a middle school relocation renovation question. They've dealt with race relations. They've dealt with environmental sustainability issues using the study circles technique. They even created a group called Portsmouth Listens, which is an ongoing group of citizen volunteers who help convene residents on local issues. Portsmouth Listens is ready. It's not a part of the city council. It's not part of any group. It's its own freestanding. We will help facilitate dialogue if you have an issue. So Portsmouth is pretty special in its long-term breadth and its depth of deliberative process. But it's not alone. It's one of the hundreds, probably thousands, of communities in the past decade that have taken on complex issues with a dialogue and deliberation approach. So we tell a bunch of the stories in our Slow Democracy book, and we've collected more since then. So we'll take a quick look at a few other stories of ways that people have used these tools. Participatory budgeting. This is a really fascinating technique, pioneered about 30 years ago in Brazil, but it's now used across the globe. More than 1,500 cities and towns, 8 districts in New York City, 4 wards in Chicago use it. The US actually has been pretty slow on the uptake. Other countries across the world have been picking it up faster. And it actually offers citizens the same kind of power that we have at New England town meeting, although oftentimes it takes place in big cities. So here, citizens, actually you don't have to be a citizen, residents, not elected. They just come, like a town meeting, work together to create and make binding decisions on the budgets for discretionary, it's a discretionary piece of the budget. So it's not the entire city budget, but pieces that the city leaders have set aside and said, okay, you know, what's it gonna be? Is it gonna be a park? Is it gonna be bike paths? You know, different things that people care passionately about. The United Nations has named participatory budgeting a good governance practice. And because of its approachable process, and its clear link to positive change. Clearly people can see, I dreamed up this idea of that pocket park, and then we got thousands of dollars to do it, and now it's happened. What that does is it creates leaders, it creates engagement. Much more, many more young people being involved, many more people of color being involved, a whole fresh new idea of what citizen leadership can be because of participatory budgeting. Here's the slide. This is from New Hampshire. You know, some people ask me whether slow democracy is liberal or conservative. I actually think it's a stretch to call it political at all. Bryan, who is conservative, and he wrote the foreword to our book, He said, slow democracy is perfectly situated on the nexus where traditional local control conservatives and newer, small is beautiful liberals meet. A great example of that is in Randolph, New Hampshire. So that's this picture. This was a town that wanted to conserve a large tract of forest land in their community. But a lot of community members were very suspicious about involving a land trust. They were concerned about the implications for taxes and for land access. They just didn't understand it and didn't trust it. And they were able to move forward. They did a lot of talking. But one of the keys to success, I think, was the organizing team, sort of the face of the project. So this is a really interesting example. One of the members, there was a 3-member team, one of the members was a member of the Town Conservation Commission. He was employed by the Appalachian Mountain Club, so obviously an environmentalist, probably a liberal. But also on that committee was the town's planning board chair, who was a senior member of the New Hampshire State Police. He was well known in the hunting, fishing, and snowmobiling communities, so representing a more old school, probably conservative audience. And they did this organically, but a social scientist looking at what happened calls this cultural vouching. Basically, when you're able to recognize at least one like-minded representative leading the project, it helps the people who are coming into the room to learn about it open up their minds to the complexities of the issue at hand, in this case, land protection. So in the end, they succeeded in protecting about 10,000 acres of land, and it was because they were able to actually look at the issues at hand and the trade-offs rather than being in their polarized corners. So that cultural vouching, that having from the very beginning representatives from across the diverse community is a critical step. Here's another example that I really like. And this one is initiated from the left, but it's designed specifically to bring all voices into the conversation. It's just so wacky that it seems to be working. Warm Cookies of the Revolution is a civic health club in Denver. So they host events, and of course every event has free milk and cookies. And I think also has gluten-free cookies and soy milk. But the group believes that the political change that's necessary is so fundamental that it might as well be called a revolution. At the same time, they also acknowledge that politics and social change are scary, super scary. So they're trying to make it more appealing, and oftentimes more funny. So there was one of their events was called Bring Your Government, like bring it, which is sort of like a challenge in a way. And they had a panel of 3 people, a state senator, a mayoral candidate, and a local comedian, who talked about what an ideal government should look like and how to get there. And at the same time, simultaneously, while they're have we ever led anything ever before in our lives? I mean, we just saw half the people in this room say, yeah, I'm on the committee, I know how to lead. I know how to have a conversation, I know how to move forward. We don't just sit and wait for the government to help us. We are the government. And this is something we're very good at in Vermont. If the storms, sort of reveal the downside of deferred maintenance on bridges, right? Disasters can also teach us the cost of ignoring investments in neighborly communication and social capital. So one of the most low-cost ways to protect ourselves against problems, whether they're meteorological or social or political, is to strengthen that community engagement. And this last one is my favorite. It's nearest and dearest to my heart. There's amazing new research that's showing clearly that deliberation actually changes us personally as individuals. There's some solid research on people who have served on juries. And think about it, a jury it's somebody walking in off the street, and suddenly for serving on that jury, you are the government. You are making binding decisions that act on another person's life. It's an incredibly empowered role. It's amazing, really, how many of us try to get out of it. But anybody who has deliberated in a jury, you are measurably more likely to vote for the rest of your life. when you have deliberated on a jury. It often increases volunteerism. People who have deliberated on juries follow the news more. Oftentimes, deliberation can strengthen our sense of community, our sense of respect for people, so that we look beyond stereotypes. And it can cause us to be, as we started out this talk with, open to new information. It opens up our minds, which means it allows new solutions to occur. So, if you, long after the issue of the day is resolved, your work can have lasting effects. You can improve people's ability to collaborate and communicate and solve future problems. And ultimately, that's what sustainability is. If we want to go far, we're going to need to go together. So that's my little spiel, ready for questions and comments. What did it make you think about?
Well, I'll start.
Yes.
And I'm going to stand up. I don't want to stand
Yes.
up on a soapbox.
Uh-huh.
So Karen, you could get the hook if I talk too much. Hello. Hi, my name's Daryl. And I noticed that one of the books that was on the list is Hillbilly Elegy. Has anybody here read that? Few people. Well, I'm kind of an urban version of Hillbilly Elegy, raised in the inner city, and when I went to college, my father, first time I voted for the Black Panther Party, and my father voted for George Wallace. So you could see there were some divisions in our household. But more importantly, what I feel, Barbara and I have talked about this, and Barbara's getting more active in Barnet area of putting together the conversations. And one of the things I bring up is that it seems like we're all pretty white, pretty middle class, and maybe not in touch like I was in touch with the inner city as a young boy, and how throughout my life I've worked with people coming out of prison, gangs, and so on and so forth. And I'm not saying that to get on a soap opera, but I notice here we're mostly white. We're all white, in fact, in Vermont, almost. And I would suggest that probably most of us come from a liberal viewpoint, maybe not, I hope not. So I wonder, for example, at Carmichaeling, where I helped a project putting on a roof, where we had all the roofers, 12 or 13 pretty rough guys, having lunch with us, and Barbara came over to talk to them about possibly this whole process. And to the person, except for a woman who was there, they were pretty reticent and pretty shy about that possibility. And I wonder how we can reach into people like the Take Back the Vermont people, and who we might all be here or not, I hope, and include, or if you look at the inner cities, we're pretty white and pretty black, and the inner cities are, having major struggles. How do we really bring us to a point where we can really reach out to people that we typically almost never see? I think that to me is the big challenge, and it's the one I raised to Barbara, and it's the one I would raise tonight, and I don't mean necessarily to get us onto a whole conversation about that, but I see that as a big kind of weakness in the infrastructure of what it is we're doing. How do we solve that?
Great. That's a really, really, really important question. I guess you can hang on to that until the next question. I'd be glad to talk a little bit about that. Does anybody have any first, I don't want to jump right back in. You've been listening to me for a while. If anybody else has a thing that they want to say about that, yeah.
Just to make that point a little even further, I just wanted to add to that observation, like, we're all here, motivated to come and participate. It seemed like after the election, the liberals were doing all the soul searching, and I'm just wondering, like, I don't see groups of conservatives doing this. So is it because it's a class issue, or is it just not part of the way they operate, or how come that's one-sided? You know, like, we want them to be here, but why aren't they? Do they not even do this kind of thing? Is it a liberal thing to do this? I don't know.
Such a great question. And
Anybody,
you know, it's
anybody
funny.
here identify as conservative?
Somewhat. There's definitely some issues I am conservative on, but
Well, that's really hard. You really want people to raise their hand in this crowd.
Well, how about non-liberal, non-conservative?
Yeah, I'd raise my hand.
I'd raise my hand.
So a couple different things, and I talked a little about cultural vouching, which is just a term for if we actually have friends or relatives who we love, who we can communicate with, where there's trust already, to invite them to invite their friends into one of those living room conversations. So if you know a person, I know a guy who knows a guy. That's one way to invite someone into a more formal conversation. But to your question, I actually brought this slide because I thought I might get this question. And it is a really, really important question. We talk about this in our book. By the way, we have a chapter called Inclusion, and there's lots of different ways to look at the question of inclusion and how do you invite people in. But we also have a chapter on cultural cognition. This is a project from Yale Law School, and it's a complex process that they've developed, but this is looking at the Americans and how Americans develop their own worldview. And so you can look at these axes and sort of figure out where you might place yourself. Are you a person who believes in egalitarianism, that everybody's pretty much equal, or are you a person who is stronger in terms of hierarchy, and you believe that people should be judged on merit or on categories that they may belong to, male, white? Before we start thinking that every hierarchy is a racist, keep in mind, how do you choose who's going to do brain surgery on you? All of a sudden, merit starts to kind of go up there in your in your worldview of things that you value. Where are you on the up-down spectrum in terms of egalitarianism versus hierarchy? And on the sideways one, individualist versus communitarian. Over here, everybody for themselves. These are people who really value individualism. Over here, society's role is really to take care of each other. So you can see that there's a spectrum, and that people might actually wind up in one of four quadrants, right? You could be a hierarchical communitarian, you could be an egalitarian communitarian, an egalitarian individualist, a hierarchical individualist. Does everybody know where they are? Everybody know which quadrant you're in? It's kind of funny how it works out. But the thing that struck me these questions, and by the way, they have lots and lots of ways to determine where a person might be on the spectrum, but through questionnaires and interviews, they have figured out that this spectrum is actually a better predictor of what position you're likely to take on any given political issue than any of the other factors that we might think, like your education or your economic status, or whether you're a woman or whether you're black or whether you're Republican or conservative or Democrat or liberal. All of those categories are less predictive than this one. This one it really predicts an issue that you've never even heard of. They can predict where you might come down. One of the things that's really compelling to me about this is that each of these quadrants responds to the question of engagement differently. So, if you're here tonight, I'm just going to take a guess that a bunch of people, that we're communitarian egalitarians. Because this is the quadrant called the Mother Jones quadrant, by the way. People in this quadrant appreciate deliberative dialogue. They appreciate We use words, and I'm saying we, because guess what, this is where I am. We use words like inclusion and equality. We use words like consensus. Finding common ground, you probably heard me say that a couple of times tonight. It's a buzzword for people in that quadrant. Coming together, building community. The thing is that those words don't resonate for everybody. They resonate very deeply for this quadrant. But if these guys want any of these guys to come to their meeting, we need to use different ways to inspire interest. So up here, hierarchical individualists. These guys, Gordon Gekko, anybody seen the movie Wall Street? They don't want necessarily everybody at the table because another word for that is mob rule. Decision making is the job for authorities and for experts. So the folks in this quadrant really do appreciate expertise. A well-organized deliberative process, by the way, does absolutely call on experts. So if you're going to have a deliberative process, you want to really emphasize that it's not just going to be like sitting around and singing Kumbaya, that you really are also going to be having expertise, that you're going to be having data, and emphasize that by doing this process, it is going to make the body, presumably the governmental body, but whatever body it is that you're dealing with, more accountable to expert analysis. So those are words that sing for this quadrant. Down here are the leave me the hell aloneists. We probably have some of those here tonight. These are, a person way off in this quadrant would be a libertarian like Ron Paul. Respect individual opinion. And these folks, they might have been fixing your roof. It's possible they were fixing your roof. They would be very afraid of being forced into false consensus. They would be afraid that they were going to be coming into the room and everybody would be like, don't you think this and don't you want that and we all want this together. Very concerned that they're going to get forced into a sort of groupthink situation. And it's very important for us as Americans to remember that dissent does have a place in deliberation. Remember, there is such a thing as a hung jury. In fact, I've even been on a hung jury before. One person can hold up the whole process and say, no, we're not, just because 8 out of the 9 people in this room think this doesn't mean that that's the way we should go. So a skilled facilitator, if you have a community process, a skilled facilitator does not reward conformity. And you were just kind of saying, it's like, how many people here think this? And all of a sudden, the people who don't think that kind of feel embarrassed and don't want to raise their hand. A skilled facilitator also makes sure that you don't rush to group consensus. And you can also, if you're trying to make a decision, there are a lot of tools that you can, things like online tools, like online polling and things like that, are helpful for folks who are in this quadrant because they can be anonymous, but and it helps assure that the group, that all the views will get included. Can anybody think of who would be in up here? The communitarian hierarchies? I had trouble with this one at first. Stalin, right? A communist? What's that?
The Kennedys.
The Kennedys. Interesting you would say that because it's a religious Catholic. Tend to be a hierarchical communitarian. Church groups tend to. Not all church groups, Unitarians worship the question mark, right? But and also people who have worked nationally across the United States have observed that that's also common in a lot of the Native American tribes that they work with in the American West. Native American tribes who would be, these would be groups that feel responsible to the community, but they also support established hierarchies. The wisdom of elders, the wisdom of people in certain positions. The key here, these folks actually really value the fact that you're going to get clarity and closure if you're dealing with a problem. So that is something that you can, that a deliberative process will bring. But you have to use language that's going to respect their cultural and religious hierarchies. So that's just a little, it's a really wonky, fizzly way of thinking about this, but it's a way a little bit of unpacking why it is that just inviting people doesn't work. And just so you know, this is what the United States looked like. This was a couple of years before the election, so it's probably slightly more polarized. But what do you notice about the way America looks in terms of these quadrants?
Most people are on the X.
What's that?
Most people are on the X.
Most people are right here. Does this give you hope? Or what? This is where we are. Look how dense it is. The thing is, if you're watching, like, yelling heads on television, they bring this guy and this woman, right, to the podium. Those are the ones you hear from, or maybe sometimes people out here. But this is where most Americans are. Look at that dense, packed, place where people can hear each other and understand each other. I think that's the most important pattern that I see here. I mean, another one, obviously, is that there's a bit of you can see sort of red state, blue state thing happening in the sort of diagonal stretch there. But, I think that it's interesting to issue framing, the way you frame the question, and invite people in, and what you promise might come out of that conversation is a way to help open it up. Yeah.
So I was struggling with this four square there, and in my imagination I was trying to figure out how in the world would you draw that to include people who are spanning those divisions there, and I came up with a circle right where you are. But is there a way to label that? Is there a way to draw it so that there are little tendrils off of each of these quadrants there that kind of reach across those boundaries and invite people to think about?
Yeah, I mean, I want to draw a big heart here, but that's because I'm one of these.
As an individual, so I might respect the hierarchy of the elders' wisdom while also respecting the fact that I have some individual tendencies or whatever it is. So that's what I'm struggling with this.
Yeah, I mean, again, we're talking usually when we're talking about these things, we're talking about those wicked problems, right? And so it's going to be through communication. It's going to be through finding folks who represent these different quadrants and getting to know them, asking them, what words do you respond? And that's certainly something that the Better Angels Project did a lot of, and they asked questions like, so, Clinton supporters, what do you, what stereotype bothers you the most? And they can and so Trump supporters, what stereotype about yourselves bothers you the most? And then hearing that from the other side is a very powerful way to diffuse some of the stereotypes and to feel how hurtful it is for both sides, to bring people to more clarity about the ways that their perceptions are doing damage to the fabric of our communities. I don't know if there's one simple word or one simple tactic, but I did leave a bunch of these out in a basket, these Conversation Cafe flyers. They're tiny enough to fit in your wallet, and I was just looking at this today. It talks if there's some ground rules for having a conversation that you learned in preschool, but they're good reminders. There's some techniques for actually bringing people together, but then some of the questions for going deeper, I think, are good ones. Especially when someone's saying something to you that you might disagree with, these are good reminders to carry in your wallet. What happened that led you to that point of view? How does this issue affect you personally? I'm curious, can you say more about that? Here's what I heard. Is that what you mean? These are the kinds of questions that if we stopped and asked rather than sort of responding with some of our knee-jerk reactions might help us to understand some of the differences and find the commonalities instead. So I like carrying these around, sort of, just to remind myself sometimes. Other thoughts and questions?
I was just going to say that I'm realizing that I'm very very often see people and they remind me of animals. And so, like, I don't blame a chicken for being a chicken, and I don't blame, like, a St. Bernard for being a St. Bernard versus, like, a poodle. So when I look at people, and it's not that I dehumanize them, but I bring humor to my perceptions of them. So I just, because...
I'm dying to know what kind of animal you think I look like. It's okay, you can tell me later.
But I'm just realizing that this coping mechanism that just arose naturally for me as a young person, because I was terminally serious about everything, that now I'm finding that when we're talking about these, that I just think, I can bring my own quirky thing that works for me and feel more confident that it's a perfectly workable method, if it works for me, as a way to open up my mind when meeting someone else and to take the seriousness out of it and bring, like, humanity into it.
Because presumably you like all animals.
Well, I don't like all animals, but I respect them, because I'm not in charge. I didn't make the animals, and so whatever made the animals has much greater perspective and wisdom than I do. And so I'm just one of them, I'm just one of the animals, and I'm sure there's animals that don't like me. So when I even the playing ground, but there's something, like, when I have a lens on myself, where I become equal with, and I make it into animals, or somehow it happens, but it is really humanizing, actually. And I just share that because I'm realizing, oh wow, I guess this has been my way to relate with really, really different people. That's been just survival that was working for me.
Another one of the books that I recommend on there for those of you who like reading, and it's actually a really good book on tape, audiobook as well, is The Righteous Mind. Is anybody? It's on the list there by Jonathan Haidt. Very interesting and challenging, especially for liberals, to think about the different sort of moral taste buds that we're born with. That's how he describes it, and how conservatives and liberals have a different sense of morality, and that we perceive things differently, and it actually brings us to different places politically. So a really fascinating sociological and psychological look at that probably would change your perception. I don't know if it would make you see animals, but change your perception of every person you meet. Yeah. Thoughts or questions? Yes.
I was hoping it would take longer to get the microphone so I could get my words together. Because I know what I want to ask, I'm just not quite sure how to ask it. In looking into civil discourse, which I've been doing for the last 5 or 6 months, it struck me that there are people that are willing and able and eager almost to engage in a civil discourse. And there are people that run the other way. And I'm wondering if you have looked at that, or if there's research on that, or what is I have a hypothesis, but I'm just wondering if there's any actual data on that distinction.
Well, certainly this data definitely shows, that basically these guys will definitely run the other way. Not that it's not they don't value civility or discourse, but they don't see a whole lot of purpose in inviting, non-experts into a discussion. Down here, these folks actually probably, they are often libertarians, but they, perfectly happy to sit down and have a beer with somebody or whatever. But again, are not interested in I even, as town moderator, I can say that a lot of libertarians resist coming to town meeting because they're afraid that they're going to be forced into a false consensus, which I think that they're right, that we need to be better about that.
So if the Southeast group wants to engage in the Northwest group, but the the Northwest group doesn't want to engage. Do you have a suggestion?
Right, yes. Well, again, each of these groups does value, we don't live in, we aren't all hermits. These guys are probably the most hermit-like, but we aren't hermits, we are social animals, and we have to live together, and we have to make decisions together. We drive on the same roads, and some folks are trying to more to live in enclaves where they don't have to send their kids to the same schools as the other kids, and the truth is that we live in society, and so again, the sort of the draw for someone here is we will be able to hold ourselves and our leaders more accountable if we have this dialogue process, this deliberative process where we bring in all of the answers. And so accountability is important. Getting closure, not having constant ongoing rancor is really valuable. I mean, that's valuable to most people, but it's especially valuable to this quadrant. Being assured that I'm not going to be in that false consensus situation is important to these guys, but remembering that face-to-face conversation isn't the only way that we can communicate what matters. And there's other ways to bring in people's opinions so that we can maybe reframe the question in a way that is more representative of the group. And so whether that's, surveys or, anonymous polling or, those kinds of things can be really valuable to making sure that this group gets brought in as well. And it can be also just if you know somebody who is like that, because again, we all have families, we all have neighbors, and having a conversation and saying, how do you feel about the tenor of the conversation that we've been having in our community about whatever it is, the highway bypass, whatever word, whatever thing. Do you wish that it was different? Do you have any ideas for changing it? And sort of, a one-on-one kind of thing to change the...
Starting on the smaller.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Starting small, that's always going to be my answer. That's always, if you look at my books, that's always going to be my answer. Start small. Yes?
I think part of the reality, too, is the heart shape in the center.
Oh, yes.
Is where most people are. And I think a lot of what you're describing, when you generally describe each quadrant, are a lot of the outliers.
Yeah.
So when Jen was talking about, how do I engage somebody in the top left? Well, you probably could engage somebody in the heart, but you're probably never going to engage the people that are the outliers. You're probably never going to engage, or chances are, you're not going to engage people that are the outliers.
It's certainly not where I'd start.
Yeah, and eventually it may come to that. And I think what's hard is the categorization itself. Because we were talking a lot about conservative and liberals, and Bill said, well, what about neither? And I think that's the problem, is everybody, not the problem, but a problem that comes up is like, well, which are you? And once I know what you are, then I know what you believe on all of these subjects, and I can just list them.
Which isn't true.
Which isn't true for anybody, especially if you're near the heart, because everybody has waffling. So I think that's where my own section, you try so hard to make sure you're wording it correctly, but you shouldn't be trying to word it correctly just to engage others. You're trying to word it correctly because you're not the only ones here, because people don't think that way. They are a goose rather than a frog, it's, so it is, it's not just for the engagement, it is truly because people think differently.
Absolutely, and it's the downside of any theory, is that it somehow creates us, them, boxes, it's the risk of trying to discuss it and in some ways it's like, let's just throw away this whole PowerPoint and just this is what's important, okay? Let's just ask these questions. How did you get there? Tell me a story, and that is those personal connections. And again, I'll always say start small. I'll always say start one-on-one. And in fact, if you are in the heart and this person might know somebody here, and this person might know somebody here. So it can be an expanding, if the process itself is trustworthy and authentic, then it can be an expanding one. And people don't, if they're not feeling like they're being hoodwinked into something. Any other thoughts come up for folks? All right. Oh, and one more. Yeah.
I love 4-cell squares. I just want to tell you, I have 9-cell squares even better.
Ooh.
But it seems to me that there's got to be a third dimension.
Yeah, I know. It's the first thing you think of, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Which I would say would be sort of how important that spot is for the person. How much their identity is really connected to them being there, as opposed to all the other things they do in their life. Because for some people, it's not going to be that important.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, there's so many things that we can connect on that have nothing to do with these kinds of worldviews. They just have to do with our dog or our kids or the green, beautiful, incredible green that's around us. Well, thank you. Thanks so much for coming. I don't want to wear you out, but I'm glad to talk more and answer questions. Stick around if you want. All right. Thanks a lot.